I watched my ex-husband's face drain of color as the auctioneer's gavel came down. Sold. The complete manuscript collection of Isabella Chen, including all original drafts and correspondence, for $42 million. Marcus's hand trembled around his champagne flute. Beside him, my former sister-in-law Sarah looked like she might vomit on her couture gown. I smiled serenely from my private box, my own glass raised in a silent toast. They didn't know I could see them. They never knew anything about me, really, especially not that I'd died once already and come back with a mission. Ms. Chen, my agent whispered beside me. The buyer wants to meet you. It's the Rothschild Foundation. Of course it was. In my previous life, that same foundation had tried to acquire my work for decades, work that Marcus had burned in a fit of rage after our divorce, work that had only become recognized as genius after my death in a car accident at 38, broken and alone. Work that was now, in this second chance at life, the most sought-after collection in contemporary literature. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The champagne went down smooth as silk. Nothing like the cheap wine I'd choked down in my first life, trying to numb the pain of Marcus's endless criticism. Your handwriting is messy, Isabella. How can you expect anyone to take you seriously? You're embarrassing me. That had been his favorite line. That and, why can't you be more like Sarah? She's actually accomplished something. Sarah. My college roommate turned best friend, turned sister-in-law when she married Marcus's brother, David. Sarah, who had stolen my thesis. Sarah, who had published it under her own name while I was hospitalized after Marcus pushed me down the stairs. Sarah, who had built an entire academic career on my ideas, my research, my words, while I was dismissed as the troubled wife of a respected businessman, my messy handwriting proof of my instability. In my first life, I'd died never knowing the full extent of their betrayal. I'd died thinking I was worthless, that Marcus was right, that my writing was nothing but the scribbles of a delusional woman. Then I woke up on my 22nd birthday, the day before I met Marcus at a gallery opening. The memories had hit me like a physical blow. 38 years of life compressed into a single moment of crystal clarity. I'd sat on the edge of my bed in my tiny apartment, gasping, tears streaming down my face. I remembered everything. Every cutting remark, every theft, every betrayal, the stairs, the hospital, the divorce that left me homeless, the years of poverty and rejection, the accident that finally ended it all. And I remembered what had happened after I died. The news articles, the retrospectives, the literary critics who discovered my genius in the boxes of manuscripts salvaged from my storage unit, the exhibitions, the books written about me, the revelation that Sarah's entire body of work was actually mine, proven by my original handwritten drafts, the messy handwriting that Marcus had mocked, now analyzed and authenticated by experts as uniquely mine. I'd become a legend in death. My notebooks sold for millions. Universities taught courses about me. Sarah had been exposed, disgraced, stripped of her degrees, and Marcus? He'd made a fortune selling my effects. The manuscripts he hadn't burned, the paintings I'd done as therapy, even the journals where I'd documented his abuse, all sold to collectors and museums. He'd given interviews, played the grieving widower, positioned himself as the keeper of my legacy. The bastard had profited from my death. But that was the old timeline. This time, I was going to write a different story. The morning after my 22nd birthday, I'd looked at my reflection and barely recognized myself. I was young again. Unbroken. My body didn't carry the scars from the stairs, from Marcus's accidents, from years of stress and poverty. My hands didn't shake. My eyes were clear. I'd spent that first day just existing in the miracle of it, touching my smooth face, my straight shoulders, breathing without the wheeze of damaged ribs. Then I'd gone to my desk and opened my journal, the one that in my previous life I hadn't started until after I married Marcus, when the abuse had gotten bad enough that I needed to document it. This time, I began differently. I remember dying, I wrote in my naturally flowing cursive, the handwriting that Marcus would call messy, that experts would later call distinctively expressive and emotionally raw. I remember everything, and I'm going to make sure it never happens again. The gallery opening was the next evening. In my first life, I'd gone because my art history professor had given our class free tickets. I'd been admiring a sculpture when Marcus approached me, all charm and confidence in his expensive suit. He'd complimented my unique perspective on the piece, bought me a glass of wine, and asked for my number. I'd been flattered. He was 28, established, sophisticated. I was a naive literature student who'd never had a serious boyfriend. By the time I realized what he really was, a narcissist who needed someone to control, to diminish, to own, I was trapped. This time, I didn't go to the gallery. Instead, I went to the library and began to write. Not the fragmented, traumatized journal entries of my first life, but the novel I'd always dreamed of writing. The one that, in the old timeline, I'd only managed to finish in the year before I died when I had nothing left to lose. The one that had been discovered posthumously and declared a masterpiece. I wrote for 16 hours straight, my hand cramping but my mind crystal clear. Every word I'd struggled with before came easily now. I knew exactly what I wanted to say, exactly how the story needed to unfold. It poured out of me like water from a broken dam. When I finally stopped, I had the first 3 chapters of The Empty House, the novel that would make my name. Over the next weeks, I fell into a rhythm. Classes in the morning, writing in the afternoon and evening. I avoided the places I knew Marcus frequented. I blocked the number he'd used to call me in the first timeline after getting it from a mutual acquaintance. When he showed up at my apartment building one evening, because narcissists don't like being avoided, I pretended I wasn't home. He eventually gave up. I later learned he'd moved on to another young woman, some other victim to mold and break. Sometimes I felt guilty about not warning her, but I had to focus on my own survival first. And Sarah, my dear friend Sarah, my roommate who made me coffee every morning and borrowed my clothes and listened to my dreams. Sarah, who I now knew was a thief and a liar, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment would have come in my senior year when I was supposed to meet Marcus and become too distracted and emotionally destroyed to notice her stealing my thesis. This time, I was ready. I kept my thesis research hidden. I worked on it only in private, never discussed it with her, never left my notes where she could find them. I watched her, this girl I'd once loved like a sister, and saw the calculation in her eyes when I mentioned academic achievements, the envy when professors praised my work. She was poison. I'd just been too naive to see it before. By the end of my junior year, I'd finished The Empty House. The manuscript was 500 pages of handwritten text, because I'd learned in my previous life that I thought better with a pen in my hand, that the physical act of writing connected my mind to my heart in a way typing never could. It was also proof, indisputable proof of authorship that no one could steal or claim. I had it professionally scanned and saved multiple copies, but I kept the original. Then I did something I'd never had the courage to do in my first life. I sent it to literary agents. The rejections came fast and brutal, too long, too experimental, too dark, not commercial enough. I papered my wall with them, each one a small victory because I was trying, I was fighting, I was refusing to be silent. Then, on a Tuesday morning in October, I got the call. Ms. Chen, this is Miranda Ashworth from the Ashworth Literary Agency. I read your manuscript over the weekend. I couldn't put it down. I'd love to discuss representation. I'd sunk to the floor of my apartment, phone clutched in my shaking hand, and sobbed. In my first life, this call had never come. In my first life, The Empty House had been published by a small university press 3 years after my death, after someone found the manuscript in my storage unit. In this life, I was going to be published at 23. Miranda was a force of nature. Within 2 months, she'd started a bidding war between 5 major publishers. The advance they eventually offered me was more money than I'd seen in my entire first lifetime. Enough to graduate debt-free, enough to rent a better apartment, enough to never, ever be financially dependent on someone like Marcus. I took the money and invested half of it based on my knowledge of the next 15 years. Tech companies that would explode, real estate in neighborhoods that would gentrify, Bitcoin when the time came. I was going to be more than comfortable. I was going to be wealthy. The other half I spent on security, professional document storage, lawyers, copyright protection for everything I wrote. I wasn't going to lose my work again. The Empty House was published in the fall of my senior year to widespread critical acclaim. It made the New York Times bestseller list in its second week. My professor framed the first review from the Times and hung it in her office. Sarah stopped speaking to me. Good. I didn't need her friendship. I needed her gone. Graduation came and went. I'd been accepted to a prestigious MFA program with a full scholarship, but I deferred for a year to write my second novel. I was famous now, not celebrity famous, but literary world famous. People recognized my name. They wanted to interview me, to photograph me, to know my story. I gave them a carefully curated version. The struggling student who wrote a masterpiece. The young author taking the literary world by storm. I smiled for cameras and said all the right things about inspiration and process. I never mentioned the first life. I never mentioned Marcus or Sarah or the abuse and theft that had killed me. I was saving that story. My second novel, Reconstruction, came out when I was 25. It was more experimental than the first, a fragmented narrative about identity and rebirth. The critics called it audacious and transcendent. It won the National Book Award. I wore a silver dress to the ceremony and gave a speech about finding your voice after silence. In the audience, I saw Sarah sitting in the back row, her face twisted with envy. She'd published her own book by then, a mediocre academic text that got polite reviews and disappeared without a trace. She'd tried to steal my work again, of course, broke into my apartment, hacked my email, even attempted to befriend my editor. But I'd been prepared. Every document was protected. Every conversation was recorded. When she tried to submit an essay under her name that was clearly based on my unpublished notes, my lawyers buried her in cease and desist letters. She was desperate now. Her academic career was stalling. She needed a win, something to prove she was more than just my former roommate, the girl who'd known me before I was famous. That's when I set the trap. I let her discover a flash drive in a coffee shop where I knew she'd be. On it was what appeared to be the draft of my third novel, a sprawling epic about family betrayal. It was actually a honeypot, a complete manuscript, but one that was registered with the Copyright Office under my name with a timestamp, filled with deliberately unmarketable prose and plot holes. Sarah took the bait. She spent 6 months revising it, shopping it to agents, finally getting a small press to agree to publish it. She was triumphant. Finally, she'd beaten me. The book came out to devastating reviews. Critics called it derivative and a pale imitation of Chen's work. One reviewer noted that several passages seemed oddly reminiscent of my published novels. Another pointed out that the handwriting in the manuscript photos Sarah had posted on social media, proof of her process, was clearly not the same as in her previous work. Then my lawyers filed suit for copyright infringement. The case was open and shut. I had the registered copyright with timestamps. I had the original handwritten manuscript in my distinctive hand. I had multiple witnesses who'd seen me write it. Sarah had nothing but the flash drive, which forensic analysis showed had been created on a specific date, proving she couldn't have been working on it for as long as she claimed. She was ordered to pay damages. Her book was pulled from shelves. Her publisher dropped her. The university where she'd finally gotten a teaching position fired her for academic dishonesty. Sarah was ruined, and I was just getting started. By the time I was 30, I'd published 5 novels, 2 collections of short stories, and a memoir. Every book was a bestseller. Every book was written entirely in longhand first, my messy handwriting filling thousands of pages of expensive notebooks. Collectors began to seek out my manuscripts. Museums wanted to exhibit them. I'd bought a house in upstate New York, a rambling Victorian with a library and a studio. I'd invested wisely and was worth tens of millions. I dated occasionally, but never seriously. I'd learned that lesson. Then one evening, I got a call from my lawyer. "Isabella, you're not going to believe this. Marcus Grayson is trying to sue you." I'd been waiting for this. In my first life, Marcus had destroyed me slowly, methodically. He'd isolated me from friends, controlled my money, crushed my confidence, and finally, physically harmed me. But what I'd realized in the second life was that his abuse had always been about control, about making himself feel powerful by making me feel small. And now I was powerful. I was everything he'd tried to prevent me from being. "What's the suit?" I asked, though I could guess. "He claims you based the abusive husband character in Reconstruction on him. He's suing for defamation and emotional distress." I smiled. "Send me everything." The character in question was named Martin. He was a businessman who systematically destroyed his wife's confidence and creativity. The novel showed his tactics in brutal detail: the gaslighting, the financial control, the criticism disguised as concern, the escalating violence. It was Marcus. Exactly. Down to specific phrases he'd used. Except I'd never met Marcus in this timeline. We had no history. There was no proof we'd ever even spoken to each other. How is he claiming I knew him? I asked. That's the thing, my lawyer said. He's saying you must have known him because the resemblance is too specific. He's essentially admitting to everything the character does by claiming it's him. It was perfect. Marcus had walked into a trap of his own making, his narcissism unable to conceive that someone could imagine such a character without having met him. He couldn't stand the idea that he wasn't special, wasn't unique in his cruelty. Let him sue, I said. I want this to go to court. The trial was a media sensation. Marcus's lawyers tried to show that Martin was clearly based on him, pointing to similarities in profession, appearance, and behavior. My lawyers countered that these were common characteristics, that I'd researched extensively, that I'd interviewed dozens of abuse survivors. Then they brought out the evidence of Marcus's actual history. His previous girlfriend who'd gotten a restraining order, his brother David's ex-wife who testified about his temper, his employees who'd witnessed his verbal abuse. The jury found in my favor after just 3 hours of deliberation. Marcus was ordered to pay my legal fees, nearly $2 million. The judgment left him financially devastated, but I wasn't done. Because during the discovery process, my lawyers had uncovered something interesting. Marcus had married Sarah. My former best friend and my almost husband had found each other, bonded over their shared hatred of me and my success. And they'd been plotting. The emails between them were enlightening. Plans to discredit me, ideas for books Sarah could write that would expose the real Isabella Chen, discussions about how to access my unpublished work, Marcus offering to seduce me, to get close to me, to find my weaknesses. It was pathetic and infuriating and absolutely perfect. Because conspiracy to commit fraud is illegal. And now I had evidence. My lawyers filed criminal charges. The DA was happy to prosecute. High-profile defendants, clear evidence, a famous victim. Sarah and Marcus were arrested in a coordinated raid that every news outlet covered. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. Both of them were convicted. Sarah got 4 years for fraud and attempted theft of intellectual property. Marcus got 6 for fraud, conspiracy, and violation of his restraining order from the ex-girlfriend. I attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row in designer clothes, my latest manuscript, handwritten, always handwritten, on my lap. I wanted them to see me. I wanted them to know that every attempt to destroy me had only made me stronger. When the verdicts came in, I didn't cheer, I didn't gloat. I simply stood, gathered my things, and walked out of the courthouse into the flash of cameras. Ms. Chen, how do you feel about the verdict? A reporter called. I paused, turned back, smiled. I'm grateful for justice. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a book to finish. That was 5 years ago. Now, at 35, I stood in this auction house watching the Rothschild Foundation buy my complete archives for $42 million. Sarah was in a minimum security facility, teaching GED classes to other inmates. She'd tried to write a tell-all book about me, but no publisher would touch it. She'd been discredited too thoroughly. Marcus had gotten out on good behavior after 3 years. He'd tried to rebuild his business, but the conviction had ruined him. Last I heard, he was working sales at a car dealership, living in a studio apartment, drowning in debt from the lawsuit judgment he couldn't pay. Neither of them would ever recover. Neither of them would ever have power over anyone again. As for me, I'd just sold my archives for more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. The manuscripts they'd once dismissed as messy scribbles, the handwriting Marcus had mocked, were now considered treasures. Museums would display them. Scholars would study them. They'd outlive me, outlive everyone. Proof that I'd existed, that I'd mattered, that I'd won. Ms. Chen, my agent touched my elbow. The representative from Rothschild is here. I turned to meet them and my breath caught. She was an elegant woman in her 70s, silver hair swept back, wearing a black suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in a year. Her eyes were kind but sharp, taking in every detail. Ms. Chen, she said, extending her hand, I'm Victoria Rothschild. I've wanted to meet you for a very long time. The honor is mine, I said, shaking her hand. Walk with me? She gestured toward the private viewing room where my manuscripts were displayed under glass, illuminated like the precious artifacts they were. We walked in silence for a moment, past pages of my handwriting, the loops and curves that had once been called messy, now analyzed and admired. Past the early drafts of The Empty House, showing my edits and revisions. Past the notebooks where I'd worked out plot points and character arcs. You know, Victoria said quietly, we tried to buy your work before, many years ago. I looked at her sharply. Before? She met my eyes, and something in her expression made my pulse quicken. In another life, perhaps. But we were too late. You were already gone. The world tilted slightly. What are you saying? Victoria smiled, sad and knowing. I'm saying that some stories deserve a second chance. Some writers deserve to see their work celebrated while they're alive to enjoy it. She paused. And some of us remember things that haven't happened yet. Or that happened differently. My hand went to the locket around my neck, the one I'd bought myself on my 22nd birthday, in this life as a reminder. Inside was a photo from my first life, me at 35, thin and haunted and broken, taken a month before the accident. You remember, I whispered. Not everything, not like you do, but enough. Victoria turned back to the manuscripts. I was at your posthumous exhibition, in that other timeline. I bought your journals, the ones where you documented the abuse. I read every word. I wept for you, this brilliant woman who died never knowing her worth. She looked at me again, eyes bright with unshed tears. When I woke up on my 60th birthday, in this timeline, with memories of that exhibition, with memories of your genius discovered too late, I made myself a promise. If I had a chance to change things, I would. How? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I'd thought I was alone in this, the only one who remembered. I don't know, Victoria admitted. I don't know why we remember or how we got this second chance. I don't know if there are others. But I do know that I've spent the last 15 years making sure I'm in a position to help you now while you're alive to benefit from it. She gestured to the manuscripts around us. This collection is worth far more than $42 million. We both know that. But it's what I could justify to the board, and every penny will go to you. You'll never have to worry about money again. You'll be able to write whatever you want, however you want, for the rest of your life. I felt tears prick my eyes. In my first life, I'd died alone and poor. In this life, I'd won. I'd already won by writing my books and exposing my enemies and building a life of my own. But this was something else. This was proof that I hadn't been crazy to remember, that the universe itself had bent to give me justice. Thank you, I said, my voice breaking. Victoria pulled me into a hug. This woman who'd been a stranger but also wasn't, who'd mourned me in another life and saved me in this one. Thank you for surviving, she whispered. Thank you for writing. Thank you for letting us all see your genius while you're here to receive the acclaim. We stood there for a long moment, surrounded by pages and pages of my messy handwriting, my words that had been dismissed and stolen and burned in one life and celebrated in this one. Finally, we pulled apart. Victoria dabbed at her eyes with an elegant handkerchief, laughing softly. I'm supposed to be professional. The board would be appalled. Fuck the board, I said, making her laugh harder. Indeed. She squeezed my hand. Now we should discuss the exhibition. I want to display your work next to the great literary manuscripts. Joyce, Woolf, Morrison. You belong there, Isabella. You always did. I'd like that, I said. Then because I had to know, did you ever try to warn me? In the first life? Victoria's face fell. I tried. I sent letters to the university trying to get you scholarships, opportunities, anything to give you resources to escape. But they never reached you, and I couldn't find you after you went underground following the divorce. By the time I found out where you were, she trailed off. I was already dead, I finished. Yes? She looked at the manuscripts again. But not anymore. Now you're here and brilliant and successful and safe. Now you get the life you deserved all along. The exhibition opened 6 months later at the Rothschild Cultural Center in Manhattan. It was called The Living Legacy: Isabella Chen's Manuscripts and the Art of Survival. My handwritten pages were displayed alongside my published books, photographs of me at work, interviews where I discussed my process. The opening night gala was attended by everyone who mattered in the literary world. Authors I'd admired for years praised my work. Critics who'd once dismissed me now called me one of the greatest voices of my generation. Publishers bid against each other for my next book. I wore a red dress and let myself be celebrated. In the middle of the evening, I stepped out onto a balcony for air. The city sprawled below me, glittering and alive. I thought about the other version of myself, the one who'd died at 38, broken and alone. I hoped, wherever she was, she could see this. I hoped she knew that she'd gotten her happy ending after all, just in a way neither of us could have imagined. There you are. Miranda, my agent, joined me on the balcony. You're supposed to be inside being brilliant. I am being brilliant, I said. Just quietly. She laughed, then sobered. I got a call today from Sarah Grayson. My stomach clenched. What did she want? She's getting out in 3 months. Early release for good behavior. Miranda's expression was carefully neutral. She asked if you'd be willing to meet with her. She says she wants to apologize. I thought about it. The Sarah I'd known in college before I knew what she was. The Sarah who'd stolen my thesis and tried to steal my life's work. The Sarah who'd married Marcus and plotted with him to destroy me. The Sarah who was now in prison because of me. Part of me wanted to refuse, to let her rot in whatever guilt and regret she'd cultivated in her cell. But another part of me, the part that had died once and come back, understood that revenge was hollow if you couldn't see your enemy acknowledge your victory. Tell her I'll think about it, I said finally. Miranda nodded. For what it's worth, I don't think you owe her anything. I don't, I agreed. But maybe I owe myself the closure. We stood in silence for a moment, then Miranda said, You know what I love most about your story? You didn't wait to be discovered after you died. You discovered yourself. You saved yourself. That's rarer than you think. She was right. In my first life, I'd been a victim of Marcus, of Sarah, of circumstance. I'd been passive, waiting for someone to rescue me, to see my worth. I'd died waiting. In this life, I'd rescued myself. I'd seen my own worth. I'd fought for it, protected it, built on it until it was undeniable. My handwriting hadn't changed. My words hadn't changed. I had changed, and that had made all the difference. 3 months later, I met Sarah in a visiting room at a halfway house. She looked older than she should, worn down by prison and guilt and the loss of everything she'd tried to steal. Thank you for coming, she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. I sat across from her, silent, waiting. I don't expect forgiveness, she continued. I don't deserve it. I needed you to know that I know what I did, what I tried to do. She finally looked up, eyes red. You were my friend, my best friend. And I betrayed you because I was jealous. Because you were talented and I wasn't, and I couldn't stand it. You were talented, I said, surprising both of us. You just wanted it to come easily. You wanted to be great without doing the work. Sarah flinched but nodded. You're right, and now I've lost everything. My career, my marriage, my freedom. All because I tried to take what was yours instead of building something of my own. Yes, I said simply. Do you hate me? She asked. I considered the question. Did I? I'd hated her in my first life, in those moments before I died when I'd finally understood what she'd done. I'd hated her in this life when I was preparing my traps, documenting her attempts to steal from me. But now she was just pathetic, a cautionary tale. A person who'd destroyed herself through envy and greed. No, I said finally, I don't hate you. I don't feel anything for you at all. That was clearly worse than hatred. Sarah's face crumpled. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so, so sorry. I know, I said, standing. But sorry doesn't change anything. You made your choices. You have to live with the consequences. I turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I hope you figure out who you are without trying to steal someone else's identity. But that's your journey. I'm done with you. I walked out and didn't look back. Outside, my driver was waiting. I slid into the car and pulled out my phone, checking my messages. My publisher wanted to know when the new manuscript would be ready. Victoria had sent photos from the exhibition's tour in London. A university wanted me to do a masterclass on creative writing. My life was full. My life was mine. I opened my notebook, expensive leather, thick, creamy pages, and uncapped my pen. The words flowed in my distinctive handwriting, the script that Marcus had once called messy and that was now instantly recognizable to millions of readers. I wrote about second chances, about reclaiming your narrative, about the difference between justice and revenge, and why sometimes they're the same thing. I wrote until we reached my house, the Victorian mansion that Marcus and Sarah would never see the inside of, that was filled with my books and my art and my life. I wrote because that's what I did. Not because I had to prove anything to anyone, but because the words were mine and I loved them. And when I finally put down my pen, I looked at the pages covered in my messy handwriting, worth, according to the last auction, about $10,000 per page. And I smiled. They'd tried to silence me. They'd tried to steal from me. They'd tried to destroy me. Instead, they'd just given me better material. 5 years later, I was 40. My 10th novel had just been published to universal acclaim. I'd won every major literary award. Museums around the world exhibited my manuscripts. Universities taught courses on my work. My books had been translated into 67 languages. I'd bought a second home in Italy, a villa where I spent summers writing and drinking wine and watching the sunset over the Mediterranean. I'd fallen in love with an artist named Elena who made me laugh and challenged me creatively and never, ever tried to dim my light. Marcus had died of a heart attack at 48, stressed and broke and alone. I'd sent flowers to the funeral, white lilies, for closure. Sarah had disappeared after getting out of the halfway house. I'd heard she moved to Oregon, changed her name, worked at a bookstore. She'd never tried to contact me again. I hoped she'd found some kind of peace, though I didn't particularly care either way. Victoria had become one of my closest friends. We had dinner once a month where we talked about art and literature and the strange miracle of our shared second chance. She'd never told anyone else about her memories, and neither had I. It was our secret, our bond, proof that impossible things could happen. On my 40th birthday, I hosted a party at the villa. Friends flew in from around the world. There was champagne and laughter and a cake that Elena had made herself, lopsided but perfect. As the sun set and the party continued around me, I slipped away to my study. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the photograph from my locket, the one from my first life. The haunted, broken woman I'd been. We did it, I whispered to her. We won. I thought about burning the photo, about letting go of that past entirely, but in the end, I kept it, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of survival, of transformation, of the power of getting a second chance and refusing to waste it. I put the photo away and returned to the party, to Elena's smile and Victoria's warm hug and the sound of people celebrating my life. My actual life, not the one that had been stolen or destroyed, but the one I'd built with my own hands and my messy handwriting, and my refusal to be anything less than who I was meant to be. Later that night, after everyone had left and Elena was asleep beside me, I stood on the balcony overlooking the sea. The stars were brilliant, and the air smelled of jasmine and salt. I thought about all the versions of this life. The first one, where I'd died broken. This one, where I'd won. All the other possible timelines branching out from every choice I'd made or didn't make. In every version where I'd survived, I'd written. The words had always been there, waiting. The talent had always been real. The only thing that had changed was whether I'd believed in it enough to fight for it. Marcus had said my handwriting was messy. He'd meant it as an insult, a way to make me small. But he'd been wrong. My handwriting wasn't messy. It was mine, distinctive, unique, worth millions, not because of some external validation, but because it carried my words, my stories, my truth. And no one, not Marcus, not Sarah, not anyone, could ever take that away from me. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app, but then closed it. Instead, I went inside and got my current notebook, the one I carried everywhere. I sat on the balcony in the moonlight and wrote by hand, watching my distinctive script flow across the page. I wrote about second chances and justice and the long, hard road from victim to survivor to victor. I wrote about finding your voice and refusing to let anyone silence it. I wrote about the day I'd woken up young again with all my memories intact, and how I'd known exactly what I had to do. I wrote until dawn broke over the Mediterranean, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Elena found me there, still writing, and brought me coffee and kissed the top of my head. "Another novel?" she asked. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe just a reminder to myself of how far I've come." She read over my shoulder, then smiled. "Your handwriting is beautiful." "It's messy," I said, echoing Marcus's old criticism. "No," Elena said firmly, it's expressive. It's passionate. It's you." She paused. "He was wrong, about everything." "I know," I said, and I did. I really did. I closed the notebook and stood, stretching. Below us, the village was waking up. Fishing boats headed out to sea. Shop owners opened their doors. Life continued, mundane and miraculous all at once. I'd been given an impossible gift. A second life. A chance to do it right. I'd used it to save myself, to claim my power, to write my own story instead of being a footnote in someone else's. And I'd won. God, how I'd won. My signature on contracts was now worth millions. My manuscripts were in museums, my words were studied and celebrated. I was happy, successful, loved, free. Marcus had tried to destroy me because of my handwriting. Now that handwriting was my legacy. That, I thought as Elena pulled me back inside for breakfast, was the best revenge of all. Not his destruction, though that had been satisfying. Not Sarah's downfall, though that had been necessary. No, the best revenge was simply this: living well. Writing freely. Being exactly who I was meant to be, messy handwriting and all. I'd died once, voiceless and unrecognized. I'd been reborn, and this time I'd made sure the world heard every word, and they were still listening. Epilogue. 20 years later, at 60, I published my memoir, The Empty House, From Ashes to Triumph. It detailed everything: the abuse I'd narrowly avoided in this timeline, the theft I'd prevented, the revenge I'd orchestrated. I wrote about Marcus and Sarah with clinical precision, naming them, describing their actions, holding nothing back. My lawyers had cleared every word. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation. The book became my biggest bestseller yet. It sparked a national conversation about financial abuse, creative theft, and the long shadow of narcissistic relationships. Universities taught it in women's studies and creative writing courses. Survivors reached out to tell me their stories, to thank me for putting their experiences into words. Marcus's family tried to sue, but the case was thrown out. Everything I'd written was documented and true. Sarah, still alive, still in Oregon, gave a single interview where she admitted everything. "I was jealous," she said. "I destroyed a friendship and betrayed someone who trusted me because I wanted what she had instead of building my own life. I'll regret it forever." I never responded to the interview. I didn't need to. The memoir had said everything that needed to be said. On the day the memoir hit #1 on the bestseller list, I received a letter. It was from a young woman 22 years old who'd just escaped an abusive relationship. She'd read my book and it had given her hope. "You showed me that survival is possible," she wrote. "That we can reclaim our voices. That our word, our art, our truth matters, no matter what they told us. Thank you for living. Thank you for writing. Thank you for showing us the way." I put the letter in my desk drawer next to the old photograph from my first life. Then I sat down at my desk, picked up my pen, and began to write. Because that's what I did. That's who I was. Isabella Chen. Author, survivor, victor. The woman whose Messy handwriting was worth millions. The woman who'd died once and refused to stay dead. The woman who'd won.